The drama was the plan.
Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Eric,
Ty.
and we are ShantottoCast. Back for our I don't even I lost track of what number we are on at this point. I just
Uh,
edit them and output them.
we're on 18.
Okay,
This is
well,
18,
unfortunately, it's also our last.
as always.
I had a really bad dream last night, and I just need to take some personal time to process. I don't know when I'm going to be ready to come back for any more podcast stuff, but I don't know. I might get a therapist or something. It was pretty rough.
What was the dream?
So I was playing a match of StarCraft, but I was a professional.
Huh.
And every time I would spawn a unit, it would just die. So I couldn't actually fight against my opponent, and they just steamrolled me, and I was embarrassed in front of like 30,000 people.
Eric, you had the StarCraft dream. That means you have to play professionally.
It speaks to the futility of everything in my life.
But you know something about StarCraft is there's a lot of mixed opinions on it. Hot takes, if you will.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
That's what I actually don't know if that's right, but our episode is about hot takes. You might have seen me post in the subreddit about it. You might have seen us post on, I think we posted in the NA page about it.
Yeah, we posted in
Um,
on I think one or two Facebook groups, and of course we posted in our personal Chicago chat.
yeah, as well as the Final Fantasy TCG subreddit. And we got a lot of opinions. We got a lot of hot takes. We got some cold takes. We got some lukewarm takes. We're going to go over those. But yeah,
Let's
today's a little bit freeform. We're just going to be kind of tackling these comments and, kind of talk about how we feel about it, really.
Yeah. So before we get into that, let's take a look at the thermometer before we actually dive in, just so everyone's on the same page. Okay. Cool. So hot takes for so it's clear for everyone. The idea is that it's controversial, but it has a potential to be right. You can interpret it how you want, but typically the point is that it's a controversial opinion. It gets people talking. It kind of riles people up. A lukewarm take is, an opinion that a good amount of people could probably get behind, but there's still room for debate and argument. Not universally agreed upon. And then there's cold takes, where it's basically a unanimous, yeah, that's fact. Nobody needed to say that. We kind of understood that already. And we sprinkled in a few funny opinions we got as well.
Uh, so we got a lot of good feedback. Thanks again if you commented on the subreddit or the Facebook group. It was a lot of fun going through all of them. Not all of them are here. We just kind of picked what we considered the spiciest or kind of ones that we generally wanted to talk about. We were very biased. I was very biased. Um, yeah, should we just jump straight into it with Jeff from our local chat?
Well, I was gonna say, do we want to go in order of when we got them, or do we want to go in order of temperature? Do we want to let things cool down as we go, or do we want to let them heat up, or just kind of take it
I
as they
think it's
come?
good to just think it's good to take it as they come because then we get to kind of go back and forth between like hot take, cold take, or talk about why we think it's a cold take, why we think it's a hot take, etc.
All right, cool. So we're tempering our steel. Got it.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's start with Jeff from chat.
So he submitted two opinions. The first one is that Moogles need more support, which I considered a bit of a cold take.
I agree with that.
Thing is, like Moogles just don't have any forward support. This is something I've talked to Jeff about a lot, where we don't have like a good Moogle focused forward like Dragoons do, or any other type really has, or like monks recently with Ursula.
Right.
I feel like a lot of people kind of agree with that. Like Moogles don't have like any good like outright support, and even the Opus 2 Moogles weren't great.
Yeah. Nobody's sitting here complaining, going, "Ugh, Moogles are too good, man. Why do they have so much support?" And if that's not the case, it's fine that they get more support.
We have seen some like goofy Moogle decks, but nothing crazy yet.
Yeah.
And then moving into his more lukewarm take, and it's monsters need more support.
Yeah. Now that one, that is actual opinion.
Yeah.
Moogles needing more support was definitely a pretty much a based in fact kind of thing. But monsters needing support, that's that's a pretty, that's arguable. Some people would probably argue that monsters are in a comfortable position where, there's only a couple monster decks out there. There's still ways to abuse and take advantage of their mechanics and their options. Um, Other people would say, you know what? Yeah, monsters are kind of, I wouldn't say irrelevant right now, but they are definitely off the main stage by and
Yeah.
far. Um,
Because they do have a fair amount of support. Like if you look at Opus 11 Realm, Opus 11 Realm is an amazing monster support card. Um, and they do have just outright cards like Realm from Opus 4,
Kafka.
um, Kafka, Nagmalata in
Yep.
Ice. Like they do have support, and like we do see support for them. Even Lon is a monster support card. He's a very specific monster support card, but we have a lot more monster support than we do Moogle support.
Wait, was it Lon or
Um,
Rain?
it was Lon. Rain's the one that reduces the cost.
Okay.
Is you could choose a monster, or you could choose a monster and give it 5,000 power
Hmm.
and
Okay.
brave, I think.
Gotcha.
Um, but like monsters do have support. I do kind of agree with him that they need more solid support. They need like some structure, maybe
Mm-hmm.
like a title based monster deck or something, maybe an FFCC deck or something. Um,
Yeah, that'd be fine. That'd be
that was like
fine.
more centric around monsters. But I just wanted to kind of bring that one up.
No, that's
Ready?
understandable. That's fine.
You ready to go into the first real hot take?
Let's go.
So Juan V from local chat, hi Juan, said, "I think Y'shtola is a bad card. Sacking herself to stop a spell and then losing a defender is a bad example of a neg one."
So for
Uh,
context, before we actually talk about this one, Juan, his main TCG is Weiss Schwartz, where the concept and focus of a neg or plus or what have you is much heavier than in some other card games.
yeah,
Obviously, it's an important thing in all card games, but in Weiss Schwartz, basically, if a play doesn't plus, it's useless.
yeah.
So
How do you feel about this hot take?
I
Agree?
absolutely see where he's coming from.
Yeah,
I don't fully agree because I think it depends very strongly on what effect you're stopping. If you're losing one forward to save a bunch, like say your opponent is going to use a Shantotto on you, you got the Ishtola and a full board. Your opponent has one forward. You're gonna be like, yeah, I'm taking that loss so that I can swing in for three or something.
yeah,
Um, but then the other side of it is if your opponent's going to do something like say I don't know Bahamut Zero, um, or say like a 7-drop Odin, and you're like, okay, well I don't want that thing to break. I'll kill the Ishtola instead. You can argue that that's less helpful than it otherwise could have been as just a body.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, Ishtola is kind of becoming a one of card anyway in decks, and some other cards are kind of overtaking it.
She's not
Um,
the mandatory three of anymore.
yeah, like back when it came out, this would have been a much more controversial take. But over time, with Ishtola becoming less and less prevalent and kind of a forced include in decks, I would definitely say I think this is a lukewarm take. Um, but, you know, I think a lot of the community would disagree that it's a bad card. So,
Which makes it a hot take.
right.
Exactly. But yeah, I agree with you. Like, a big thing about this is he uses it as an example of a neg one, but a big thing with this game is because you have to discard cards to play other cards. It's a lot more powerful than he's kind of giving it credit for. Because yeah, it's a neg one to sack to remove a summon, but you also have to understand that the opponent, if they discard a card to play that summon, or if they discard a card to play that ability, or something like that, that immediately evens it up. So if I like discard a card to play Glacia to maybe swing in for game and he sacks the Yashola, that's still he still goes +1 in there because the opponent lost 2 cards, he lost 1. When instead I would have been able to push for game really. And I don't want to say Y'shtola is a bad card, because Y'shtola, I do think Y'shtola is a very good card, and if she wasn't, she wouldn't have still be seeing play.
Right?
But her ultimate usefulness is when something's targeting multiple things, or if it's something that's going to definitely turn around the game.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's also not terribly hard to bait out a Y'shtola.
But yeah, true. I mean, you and I have been in that situation before. I think we've both baited each other out quite a few
Yeah.
times. So
And if you just target the Y'shtola first, like,
then
much
it's
about
it's
it.
moot. Yeah.
So yeah, I see where he's coming from, like you, but I disagree. Number one, I do think this is a hot take, but number two, like, no, I think Y'shtola is good.
Yeah. So should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, so the next two are literally something that has been videos of ours. So I think we should just kind of briefly touch down on them.
Yeah, I think it's
But
funny though that you put them. Did you put these in this order, or is this just how you put them in there
put
as
them
you?
in this order.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So we can actually put these back to back, and we can just discuss. So Brad Manning, both of these are out of the Final Fantasy North America group. Brad Manning says none of the cards should be banned. Travis Pfeiffer, on the other hand, says banning cards is a good thing.
Yeah.
So
And it's funny because we're also on kind of opposite ends of this argument.
yeah,
Because you do believe, like, no card really needs to be banned.
right.
And I'll even concede that point. There hasn't been a card yet that desperately needed to be banned, maybe with the exception of Gesper, which is like always the asterisk I put on it.
Yeah, and I'll concede to you that, like, yeah, banning cards in the past has helped the game's health, and at certain points. So there's a gray area. It's a very wide gray area.
And I put both of these as a hot take because there really isn't a consensus, and I haven't really seen much of a consensus with people.
Yeah, I think
I
this is
still have a lot of people asking, like, hey, why can't Adeluma come back? Like, why don't we just bring back this band card? And
I think it's one of the most asked about things and talked about. I think it's the most contentious point of discussion across ever for this game since a card was banned. So I mean, yeah, I'd argue these are very hot takes, just because there's never going to be an agreement on it, regardless of whether one side is quote unquote right. I mean, hell, I'd even concede, to say cards shouldn't be banned, but they should be suspended. If a card is too good or too oppressive, then maybe you should get a slap on the wrist and told that it can't play with the rest of the kids for a couple sets. That would give the developers and designers of the game a buffer to kind of play with and decide what they want to do about that card.
That's actually something that Magic's been doing lately. I think for Pioneer, there's cards that they put on like a suspension list. I think it's almost exactly called a suspension list, where they're like, we're banning this for now. We want to see where the game goes.
That's interesting. I didn't even know about that.
Yeah.
I just thought of that like a couple days ago, looking at this list of hot takes. I'm like, why don't they just do this? Why don't they make a middle ground? And then, you, the person who actually keeps up with Magic. Okay.
But the fact that I don't play it.
Right, yeah.
Commander isn't. Oh, I want to say Commander's playing Magic, but it's not as serious. Like, I don't actually have to follow ban lists and stuff.
Yeah.
Commander gets like a new ban like once every 5 years. But, what was I saying? Oh, yeah. So, yeah, it has like the suspension list. And I think there was a big controversy in the community lately about Magic. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But there was a lot of cards that were on the suspension list that just stayed on it. And they just moved them over to the ban list. They were like, okay, yeah, no, this was a bad idea. We're just moving it over to ban list. So it was essentially kind of a moot ban list because it was like, oh, all these cards that are banned are going to keep being banned. And now we know that they're super banned.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
That was it.
Cool. Well, I'm glad Magic is figuring that out, because I mean that does seem like the natural progression from such a draconian. Okay, this card goes from playset to banned instantly. They're not even taking a book out of a page out of Yu-Gi-Oh's book.
Because they used to do way back in the day. They did set limits in Magic where you could only have one per deck.
Oh yeah,
and that's even still in Vintage. Vintage, you can only have
I mean, if that's
one of like the Power 9.
if that's when it was relevant, then yeah, you might as well keep the rule for that format. Checks out.
But moving back over to Final Fantasy, like it's as you said, like this is a contentious point in the community, and you're kind of more on the card shouldn't be banned list. I'm more on the like it's good to ban cards
Mm-hmm.
because there will always be those cards that it I don't want to call it like a designer's faux pas, but like something happens that pushes that card over the power level in which a card reasonably should be, even with power creep. And
Right.
the card I'll always point towards is Gesper. Is Gesper? He's not meta warping because even when Turbo Ice was extremely popular, it wasn't topping every tournament. It was dominant. It was a very good deck, but it wasn't the. I don't want to say it wasn't the best. It was the best, but it was beatable. It
Yeah.
was very beatable, and there were ways to play around it. There was ways to play against it. There was ways to counter it. Um, but Gesper was that card that it was. If you could get 3 Gesper out, you basically win. If you could get 2 Gesper out, you could basically win. Like it was a powerhouse of a card, and I really understand why it was banned.
Yeah.
There's certain ways could have adjusted the card. They could have made it not multi-playable, etc. But
Yeah, but
Gesper is a card I'm more than happy is banned. I think it's the only card on the ban list that I'm like 100% on that should stay there.
Yeah, I can't find much to argue with there. So we can agree on that. We can shake our hands and move on, I suppose.
So, like, yeah, both of these are hot takes, and both of them have their points. We've talked about it on episodes before, which is why we're trying to keep it brief. But,
Yeah. Go
yeah,
ahead and pick your side, argue in the comments. We're not going to read them. Who am I kidding? We are. We're going to read them.
Yeah. We both get that phone notification whenever someone comments, and we immediately we gotta.
Yeah.
So Stephen Riley.
Steven?
Steven?
Steven? Steven?
I don't know.
Are you having a case of the bone apple tea?
No, I've heard it pronounced both ways. Stefan and Steven.
Okay.
Anyway, Stephen Riley from Final Fantasy TCGNA. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, by the way. Oh, I pronounced it 3 ways, so I got it right once, at least. Minwu should have never been printed. So I assume he's referring to Opus 1 Minwu.
Hey, Ty, don't ignore that 4-drop Minwu. That's a gross card, okay?
Obviously. Well, we did a whole Fix It Friday. Or we did a better part of a Fix It Friday around him.
Well, yeah, but...
But so I assume he's talking about Opus 1 Minwu, and I see where he's coming from, but I disagree.
So I can't say that I fully disagree. You know how much I like that card. That being said, if there was a little addition on the end, or we missed a part that said Minwu shouldn't have been printed before Opus 8 or something. Like it should have been a late game kind of card, as opposed to being printed in the second set of the game. That being said, I think we'll come back to this point when we're looking at some of the later takes that you wrote down on this list.
Yeah.
Because there was another one that I saw that I could swear. Where is it? Oh yeah, that one. Okay, so that's a Reddit comment that brings me back to this Minwu discussion. So I'll get back to that with my opinion later. But I don't fully hate this one. I just really like Minwu as a card, so I'm a little biased.
Yeah. For me, I think it's... I don't know. I think Minwu is fine. I don't even think Minwu's even particularly, like, overpowered. I think it's a good card. I think it's a solid card. I mean, it's an Opus 1 card that still sees some, like, kind of scattered play. It used to see a lot of play. But Minwu is a 3-drop do-nothing, ultimately. Like, it's a card that alters the board state, and there are... Players have trouble getting around it depending on what deck you're playing. Like, if you're playing Weewa, seeing a Minwu sucks, which is why you're running Archers. Like, there's answers to Minwu, and then there's also instances in which Minwu just doesn't do anything for you, where Minwu just... It's basically a 3-drop vanilla. If you're playing against Lightning, where Lightning isn't really focused on chip damage, it's focused on outright killing, it's not great. If you're playing against, Ice generally has been either kill spells or dull and freeze. So I never minded seeing a Minwu in my ice matchup. So I was like, oh, it's a Minwu. Oh, you paid 3 mana for that? Cool. I'm just gonna dull and free stuff. I don't have to worry about killing it. I'm just pushing it down. Or I've got Shantotto, or I've got Cecil, like just outright breaks. So I don't know. Minwu. I do think Minwu is a very powerful card, but I do feel like it deserved to be there. I mean, the only thing I feel it really beats out is fire, and even fire now, thanks to Kucha Spell, has a way around it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah. For the first set of the game, when they were establishing, kind of all the mechanics and gameplay styles they wanted to encourage, kind of testing the waters and making sure that their design philosophy early on was, functional and did its job, and the players kind of grasped everything important. I think it's solid, fine include, in terms of like meta definition. Obviously, it hasn't twisted things up so heavily that it's an auto include in every water deck.
Yeah, it's definitely a card that you think of.
Yeah, it's one that you always think of, but then you're like, wait, it doesn't fit here. Don't worry about it. Or alternatively, you're like, yes, I absolutely need Minwoo, and it's pretty obvious when it's one or the other. So yeah, I disagree with this. I don't fully disagree though. I have my small little bits of agreement, but
I feel like with a lot of these hot takes, like I understand where they're coming from. I see why you think that.
mm-hmm.
I just disagree. Like it's Minwoo just has never been that oppressive of a card or that much of an auto include.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Even like when he saw the most play, he was still like a 2 of.
yeah. And also don't forget for the audience, really, we don't have full context for all these comments. Not everybody provided context for their thoughts. So, maybe it was just, I don't think this card is useful, therefore it shouldn't be printed. I mean, that could be the opinion too, for all we know. We didn't ask for clarification on every comment, so oops.
But yeah, I think we could just kind of leave it there. Like it's, I just disagree with the take. I don't know. I never thought as Minwoo was like a problem with the game, unless I was playing Mono Fire. But
well, that's you playing Mono Fire, and that's a whole different bag. That's a whole can
exactly.
of worms. So
exactly, that's people playing Mono Fire.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if a Mono Fire player wrote that.
Yeah.
Minwoo is not the card I think of when I think of a card that should not be printed.
Right. Yeah. No. That's agreed.
Not to beat a dead horse, but it's
yeah, that's my thing.
It's Gesper. It's Gesper. Gesper's the card that shouldn't have been printed. That's my hot take.
Okay, so I think we can move on to our other Juan P. From chat. So we start off with a lukewarm take. Every color should have its own board wipe.
Yeah. I don't think this is something a lot of people have thought about generally.
Yeah. It definitely isn't talked about often, but
yeah.
I actually relabeled this one. I don't know if you noticed, as lukewarm, simply because I think every color does have a board wipe.
That's funny. That was the thing I wanted to discuss. Is I wanted to say about how I do feel like every color in one way has a board wipe, even if it's weird. Because like, there's a lot of cards people like to forget about. Like, Wind actually has a complete board wipe in Valifor, and no one ever really thinks about that. Like, yeah, there's Valifor, Earth has Shantotto, obviously. Ice is a little bit weirder.
Ice, you have the Zalera, kind of. Yeah. A couple of them.
It's not like That's the thing, is it's not an unconditional board wipe. And it's the same thing with Fire. Fire doesn't have an unconditional board wipe.
Yeah.
It has a conditional board wipe. And then every color has access to a board wipe in the form of Sin and or not Veritas. Zodiark.
Yes.
Technically.
And the other one. There's one other one.
You thinking of Arc?
No. No. Well, I mean, yes. Arc, Medine,
Ultima.
Sin, and Ultima. Yes, Ultima. That's the one I'm looking for. But yeah, well, I mean, Ice, though, you could argue that wiping their hand is not letting them get a board, so
Yeah,
it's a board wipe because they don't have a board.
yeah.
Um, but then Lightning has stuff like Bahamut Zero, which is a card I always talk about how cool it is.
Uh,
Wind, like you
Plus,
said, has that kind of board wide chip damage. Water has reduction based stuff. Um, one of the
and they also have Fam for it.
yeah, oh that's right, they do have Fam for it.
And I struggle to call that like a board wipe,
Well,
but it's
I wouldn't. Yeah, Famfrit isn't a strong one to talk about. There's Cloud of Darkness though, so you can
but
still wipe a board for the most part.
yeah. But the thing is, actually thinking on it, water I think is the one color that doesn't have like almost just any sort of board wipe that doesn't just target all forwards.
Uh,
'Cause if you look at
actually,
fire, well, fire doesn't really have anything either. Now that I think about it, it's you have a board wipe in the form of Ifrita that does.
yeah.
If you have all the Ifrits in, does 3K to board. Even Wind has Valifor, which
Mm-hmm.
you could almost kind of consider it a board wipe. It's more of an AOE. But Wind also has Valifor, or has Legend Valifor. I forgot they
Right,
have the same
right.
name. That outright bounces everything to hand.
Yeah. So
But I
like,
do. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say I feel like part of the balance in the colors is that some colors do have access to that unconditional board wipe. For example, Shantotto.
Mm-hmm.
And 5-drop Valifor, despite the fact that it's not really played. It's I don't know. I feel like that's part of the color balance in a way.
Yeah, I mean, that's yeah. Every color we've talked about this in color theory is that some colors are focused more around the combo potential, or they each have their mechanic to do their own thing with, and so some colors don't even need a board wipe. But that's why it's lukewarm because I mean, for the most part, each color does have its own board wipe, but they're
I
not
mean,
necessarily effective as a Shantotto.
and to be super super specific, every color has access to Sin technically.
Yes, yeah, they have light and dark, so they have all those different options.
You're always
Um,
gonna have access to Zodiac, Ultima, and Sin. They're not great board wipes, but they're board wipes.
yeah. Um, so that one, that's really opinion based. But I'm glad it was brought up because it's something to talk about for sure. So do we want to move on and do we want to heat up before we cool down?
Yeah. Should we do Juan's other hot
Yeah,
take,
no,
or should we move on to my?
no, yeah,
Okay.
we have the other two.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
so
This
the
is one I
hot.
have a lot of feelings about.
Oh, you know what? You go ahead and introduce it and talk about it.
All right.
I'm just here.
Freezing should be buffed and be harder to interact with. So, as someone who's been playing Mono Ice forever, I disagree. I think Ice is like almost perfect, exactly where it is. Because it's not meant to. It's just meant to be that minor annoyance. It's just meant to be that temporary solution to dealing with something. Similar to like in White when you have a lot of stuff that just taps something down, or Blue rather in Magic that just taps something down and keeps it down. You're not doing that to get rid of that card. You're not doing that to make the card hard to interact with. You're doing that so you can attack over it. And that's ultimately like what dulling and freezing is doing. So I think dulling and freezing is in a place where it's fine as a mechanic, and with how many cards that we're getting that are able to just dull and freeze something, or even just free something, I think is fine. Like I don't know. What's your thoughts on it?
No, I generally agree with you. I mean, freezing stuff really wrecks a lot of decks out there.
Yeah,
There isn't a whole ton of reactivation or things that you can do about, being frozen. Um,
side of wind.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, in particular, if your backups get frozen, yikes. I think there's only a few cards that can do that out there. Ice better
Including
than I do.
my sweet boy Mute.
Yeah, I mean, Ice better than I do, but I know there's a few cards out there that can freeze your backups. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think dulling and freezing are in a pretty good spot. I think the game is kind of equalized on it because I remember early on Opus, when we got into the game, Opus, 3 and 4 and 5, dulling and freezing was like really problematic.
Yeah.
If you didn't have a, you kind of had to include a couple cards in your deck to deal with it, just in case you bumped into an ice player, or in case you were the ice player. Tie.
Yeah. Or you had to
Um,
be able to build a wide enough board that dulling and freezing. It was harder to dull and freeze because a big thing about dull and freeze is that it's very rarely multiple things. It's always one thing.
yeah.
Like look at Genesis or Celeste. Celeste is just freeze a character.
Mm-hmm.
And then you do have like the more board wide one, similar to like Shiva only dulls.
Yeah.
But
The Shivas do only like
yeah,
2 to 3, depending.
all the big ones, all the ones that do like dull and freeze a lot of stuff, it's usually at a cost where it has a condition. Like looking at
Yeah.
Ultimisia, who can freeze backup or who could freeze the opponent's backup row. Well, you're only freezing them, you're not dulling them. And looking at the new mute, which once again I'm a huge fan of, is dull and freeze all the opponent's backups if they have 5 backups. Like they have to hit that condition, and if they see that mute, they might play around with it, or they might try to optimize it where you can only use it on a turn that it won't be super handy. And yeah,
Yeah.
there's other ways around it. And like obviously the one weakness to dulling and freezing is just stuff that should just outright reactivate. But when that's so centralized just to like wind, like
Yeah.
you have that one bad matchup and that's about it.
Right. Like, yeah, you can't have a perfect, perfect web of interactions. Like, it's just how it is. And keep in mind, everybody, these this isn't us trying to convince you that like, oh, this hot take isn't really that, they're stupid. This opinion's bad, but like, the discussion has to happen about it. The controversial thoughts are there.
Yeah, because in a way, there is number one. I see why he says it, and once again, I'm going to say this with every single take on here, but it is very frustrating when you're playing ice when you dull and freeze something and it doesn't really matter, or you don't have the board state to make that matter, and you're just kind of keeping something down. But they still get an effect off of it. If you dull and freeze Elise, it doesn't turn off her ability.
Hmm.
I really wouldn't mind. Well, actually, we do have a card, Gentiana.
I was
that
just about to mention that one.
She removes effects of dull cards, but obviously that's not good enough. If we had it on a backup, like Minwoo or something,
Oh yeah, that'd be
like,
nasty.
that'd be nasty. And I feel like there's a reason why we don't have that. It's because that's a little busted.
Yeah,
too.
that well, it'd be a legend.
Yeah, like how I look at it is that like dulling and freezing something is fine, and with the price of cards that it's usually on, that's fine. Like you can't have dull and freeze be like a step below breaking because it's on so many cheap cards. Um, so ultimately, like how I just look at it is it's not that big of a deal. Like dull and freeze is already good enough. It doesn't need to be better.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with you on that. I think we're in a comfortable position.
Maybe after some power creep, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, I
right
think
now, I
yeah,
think it's more than fine.
yeah. So I guess we can cool off, get have a scoop of ice cream, relax. Something that I think we basically everybody can agree with is that Light is in desperate need for buffs and needs better cards.
Yeah.
I have strong feelings on this, mostly in agreement. That when Rain is your best Light card out there, that's my opinion. But if Rain is your best Light card, then yeah, you need to do something about it. Because you have some of those cool board wipes that are Light. You have Citra. So yeah, maybe Citra can be the best one, but like
Yeah.
you only have
I
a
mean,
couple Light cards that are really worth playing. Where the Dark cards, almost all of them have seen play at some point or another.
yeah, I'm double checking so the light and dark cards because I'm
Hmm.
just having trouble with names right now. Because like light has gotten some good cards in the form of Citra, as you mentioned. Um, Raffia even has had some time in like Warrior of Light decks.
Yeah,
Yuri is like the big good light
that's
card.
that's true. Yuri is also another good
I
one. Yeah,
think Yuri is an amazing card and it is
absolutely.
very, very good. But if you compare that to how much Hien got played, with how much Kadaj continues to see play, with
Veritas.
Veritas, with
Yeah,
Nidhogg, like it's. And then Light also had Fasoya. Fasoya was a very important card.
true, true.
I still agree with what he's saying here, where we don't have these like ridiculous universal light forwards that Dark has. Like,
Yeah,
you can throw a Veritas into any deck with very little to no issue. But you can't exactly throw in like Terra because she searches a summon. Okay, if you're
Mm-hmm.
not running a lot of summons, it's not great. Or Cloud. Oh, I need to have 7 synergy. I can't really play Cloud. Or Opus 5 Wall, which is like, oh, I need Warrior of Lights. Like the thing is, all the light cards are in one way or another conditional. But then you look at like Comlanaut. It's like, oh well, I could just put Comlanaut anywhere.
Yeah,
Or like
basically.
Eldnarsh. Oh, I just need to run 2 or 3 Eldnarsh and I'm fine.
Yeah, no, that's kind of I think what the main focal point is that Light has had good cards. We have good cards in Light. It's not that Light has been completely neglected as a color, but its effectiveness and its sustainability over time has waned and diminished. And really, the only Light cards that I would suggest putting in decks at the moment in the current, well, in the meta from 3 months ago, 4 months ago, people were playing, um, Citra, Yuri,
Yeah, that's about it.
maybe Fasoya back,
So sorry,
maybe
depending on your deck, really.
if
Like
you've
it's
got good control of the damage state of the board, yes.
yeah,
Otherwise, don't.
yeah. It's the
Yeah,
big thing. I feel like the reason why we perceive it like this is because so swingy cards. Like once again, looking at Hien and Veritas, like those cards are so swingy and they're so big. But with light, you've got Citra 3-drop 7K. Okay, it's a 3-drop 7K and add something back for me. That's decent. That's good. That's good enough to be in a lot of decks. But it's not like this card that when it comes down, you're like, oh no.
yeah. It's
Like
just kind of
Citra's just
you see it hit
Citra's
the
just
board.
Citra.
Yeah, you see it hit the board, and you're just like, ah, crap. Oh well.
Yeah. It's like the
It's
same thing with Yuri. Like Yuri was a card that you had to play around, but the thing is, if you were playing against a multicolored deck, you're like, okay, I don't need to worry about Yuri.
Yeah, or you could also honestly, if you see Yuri hit the field, it's usually got a turn before it turns on.
Yeah.
So like, okay, murk it, like dead. Now you're down to Yuri. You're down 4 mana. Oops. Like
Yeah,
it,
Yuri's still a card that you have to watch out for, but
Light has those cards that can, you gotta wait till they get really good, or they have a short-term utility. The dark cards, they're actually in flavor as they're intimidating. They're the big baddie. They matter. So yeah, that one's just. I think we can all agree that Light just needs more good cards.
it's more. I feel like better universal cards.
Yes,
Kind
yeah,
of,
that's a
kind of
better way
in
of
the
putting
vein
it.
of like Yuri.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Just kind of a card that you can auto include in everything, like Veritas, like Hein, like Reagan, that just doesn't matter where you put them, they function.
Exactly. Like it's just that's exactly it. They just need more universal cards. Like Citra. Like Citra's a great card. Finds a lot of slots in a lot of decks.
Mm-hmm. So,
Um, ready to move on to the next one?
good to go. You're up.
Sorry, I wanted to drink. My mouth's getting dry. Max Ritter from FFTCGNA says the reason why the community is so great is the size of it, and it doesn't need to grow that much. So I put this down as a hot take. It's
I think this
there's
is.
always a honeymoon period of playing a new TCG
Mm-hmm.
where the community isn't bad, and I feel like we're kind of in that. But the thing is, you should always want your game to grow.
Yeah, I mean, So the same argument has been had in so many different communities globally. I mean, you can look at skateboarding, you can look at heavy metal, you can look at video games, even, and then sub communities within video games. You can look at certain film genres. Um, the list goes on and on and on, where you kind of hit that point of perfection or perceived perfection, and then you hit the player base increasing while the quality of the community can decline. It's a weird graph,
Yeah,
but like this one again, another one of those opinions nobody will ever have a right answer to. There's never going to be one opinion that is just eventually considered fact.
Yeah, there's it's a give and take with having a larger community because you have a chance of getting worse people in it. And obviously that's always going to be a risk no matter what community you're in, video game, heavy metal, etc., etc. Um, but with a growing community is when you get more support. It's when more money's going towards the game, so there's more incentive to have larger tournaments. Like it's at the end of the day, I see where he's coming from because there is a give and take, but I feel like the benefits to having a larger community is so much greater than just keeping this small niche community. Like I think a game I think it's worth it to point out is the original Dragon Ball card game because it always had a small community, but because it had such a small community, the company didn't care for it because they were making their money back, but they weren't doing anything above that.
Yeah, they were
Like
breaking
they were
even.
able exactly, and they were able to hold these nice tournaments with the game designers and stuff. But it didn't matter at the end.
Yeah,
Like it was just like, well, yeah, but if there's only X amount of people playing,
well, that's the thing is you also at that point you risk diminishing, because if only the same amount of people are playing every time, you're not growing. How can you find the worth of putting more into the game without a guarantee to grow the game? Not to mention, if any of those players stop playing for whatever reason for the long term, then you start to neg over and over and over until it becomes an actual sinkhole of money and resources and effort, and then what, right?
because we see this issue of a lot of people. This happens on the subreddit a lot, where people will say, "Hey, I'm in X area. Are there local players?" And there will be times where the answer is just no. Uh, and by having a larger community, that means that we have more people in more places. That means that we have a lot more people who could easily come into the game. There's a lot more people who could walk into their card shop and see people playing Final Fantasy and want to sit down and try it out. Um, and we can't have that without a large community.
Yeah, I mean, it's why every time someone comes in and wants to talk about more than just the one game they play, I at least let them know that Final Fantasy exists, in particular at our shop. Just because on the off chance they get curious enough to buy into it, or at least come by to borrow a deck and try, maybe they'll go back to their home, or maybe they'll start coming into the shop and start a new community. Obviously, we have our community, but like if they go, say they're a tourist from Boston or Arizona or something, they might go home and they might order a few boxes and some starter decks and start a community at their local shop. Who knows? And then that gives more people access to the game, and it just kind of exponentially grows. It's like a party that starts with, oh yeah, we're gonna have like 5, 10 people at my place, whatever. And I'm like, okay, cool. Hey, Ty, do you mind if I invite a couple buddies? Yeah, sure, Eric. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And then my two buddies invite two friends, and they invite two friends, and suddenly there's 400 people at your house, and the whole thing's on fire.
And I don't want to tell you like, no, I want to keep this exclusively between us, because the thing is, that's not going to benefit the game. That's not going to benefit the company that makes it.
Right.
And I feel like we're both a little biased because we're both game designers, but it's just always like you got to support the company that makes the game if you want to keep playing it.
Well, especially with card
always
games, with something
especially
that
with card games,
because
card games are just such a neg for the company.
Well, not only that, but card games are something that need to have that consistent input in one way or another. Whether it's proof that interest is there from the designers, or some sort of I don't know, like card games just need to be shown. The players need to see that the people who make the game still want them to play the game. Because if they don't, then the players are gonna be like, well, you don't want us to play. You don't care if we're still playing. So yeah, I won't still play. Whatever. I'll go home and keep what I've got, and I'll play with what I've got at home, and I'll never buy another thing again. Suck it.
Exactly.
So,
and for every jerk that's going to join the community through this game getting bigger, there's always someone who's in the opposite way nice.
Yeah. I mean,
that will join the community.
I would argue for every one bad person that joins, there's like 3 or 4 good people who actually care.
Because our experiences are overwhelmingly positive, and I'd be lying if I said that I haven't run into a couple jerk players, but
I mean,
largely, I think everybody's been pretty good.
absolutely, yeah. No, I agree. I mean, my example is the Yu-Gi-Oh players at work. We have at least 80 regulars who cycle in throughout the week to play in tournaments and whatnot. And I can count still on one hand the amount of truly asshole, awful people that I've run into in the last 3.5 years working at that shop. Um, for every new person who joins that is bad, like 5 to 10 good people are coming in and kind of muscling them out with just raw, no, you're a jerk, leave, we don't want you here. So I have high hopes for, dealing with negativity, but also, growing the game so that more players come in and keep it healthy. Got to keep the blood flowing if you want the body to keep walking.
Exactly. Like it
So,
needs to grow. And once again, obviously there's the issues, but the game needs to grow.
call it growing pains.
It needs to grow a lot.
Yep. So I think we're both in agreement that we disagree with Max. Not that I haven't felt that same sentiment in other areas before, with other things or games or whatever.
And that's
Um,
understandable.
but I've kind of, I don't want to say grown past because it's not a maturity thing, but I have definitely kind of walked away from that opinion of things in the past. So,
Yeah.
ready to move on?
This is one that I really want to talk about because I feel like this is a big one for us as game designers.
Oh, yeah.
So Jacob Sedloff, I'm
I
so
think you're
sorry
right.
for everyone whose name I'm going to mess up.
I'm guessing you're
Jacob
right on that one.
Sedloff from FFTCGNA said, design philosophy shifted with Opus 10 to start introducing cards that over-centralize the meta every set in a way that didn't exist before and makes the competitive environment ultimately unhealthy, unfun, compared to how the game was in the past, barring the days of Turbo Ice and Weewa Mill. So, do you want to start on this one?
Boy, do I.
Yeah, I'll let you start because I feel like this is going to be probably a decent amount of the episode. There's another like one or two that will probably take up a bit of time.
Yeah,
But
right. I mean, we're close to the end anyway. So yeah, this one, oh man, I don't want to say weird feelings or strong feelings, but I have feelings. Um, this brings me back to the Minwoo shouldn't have been printed comment from Steven. Um, I think Minwoo should have been printed later, or Kuchas Spell, the fire card, should have been printed sooner. Because a lot of times in this game, there have been cards that the design philosophy earlier on was print a card, also print its counter within the next set or in this set, or hell, even preemptively print it. There have been lots of cards that like Veritas and Fenrir, right? Fenrir is a direct 1-to-1 answer to Veritas. They're in the same set, and yeah, Fenrir could have been a light card to counter the dark, but like it's still there. It exists in the set, and you can use it, and it doesn't require anything but its base cost. It doesn't require any yellow earth besides its base cost. You can use any other two colors for the other two CP to use it. So that kind of thing, I think, if they're going to print one, they should print the other. Now, granted, Minwoo was there to kind of deal with a lot of the chip damage coming from lightning, fire, wind, but it was dealt with by using colors like water or earth, where that stuff didn't matter anyway, or you could
even just like
it.
the hard removal from lightning.
Exactly, like you could circumvent it, right? However, as time went on, I do think that the design philosophy has somewhat shifted, and I wouldn't say it's an unhealthy level of shift, but I can see how someone would think that it can become unhealthy if it gets too much of a divide between when a card is printed and its counter is printed, or direct counter rather, intended counter. I don't know how you want to look at it. but like, imagine if there was something that came out to counter, like directly counter Dodaluma the set that it came out, or like Opus 5, like right after. Like, Dodaluma would have been DOA and it would never be banned because the answer's there, right? Um, so yeah, I think because nowadays, a lot of there are cards coming out that are focused on handling the meta or shifting the meta, concerned with the competitive scene. But that's natural for any card game when it gets bigger and a true, strong, defined meta has developed where you can look at the trends of reported events and say, yes, this card is very strong. What can be done about it? Well, none of the other 700 cards in the game, are a direct counter or have a direct way of handling this. Maybe we should print a card that handles this sooner than we planned because it's a problem or because it's so dominant. I mean, that would avoid a ban list if, we could, or it would encourage a ban list depending. So yeah, I don't think it's become problematic, but if too much time passes or too little time passes, it's a fine line to walk. It's such a weird duality because you have the two philosophies of, okay, print a card's counter as soon as that card comes out. All right, well, that card might become useless then. Alternatively, print a counter too late and that card's already become such a staple of the meta, and now things are shifting so heavily, you throw everything into chaos by giving everybody this hard, direct shutdown for it.
That, or even the potential that the counter is too good, and the counter covers more than just that card, which makes it a staple, which makes it its own problem.
I mean, that's a Yu-Gi-Oh problem, not a Final Fantasy problem. But
that's
we kind of hope
potentially
exactly
that could still potentially happen.
Oh no, exactly, and that's what I'm saying. That's when I think that Jacob will be right if that does happen. But I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, because ultimately at the end of the day, I was kind of confused about this question, because he said design philosophy shifted with Opus 10 to start introducing cards that over-centralize the meta in every set. So I was kind of thinking back, like, what came out in Opus 10 that centralized the meta? And like, first one that kind of came to mind is Rain, right?
Right.
And one second, I'm actually looking up Opus 10 just to be 100% sure that I'm looking at like what we should be looking at.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I don't think even Rain particularly over-centralized the meta. I'm struggling to think of cards in Opus 10 and 11 that centralize the meta. And I could think of decks that show up or cards that show up on a lot of decks, like Rain basically created the WAF archetype. Rampure really kind of created the Rampure deck.
But these are cards that the meta developed around, not cards that responded to the meta.
Yeah,
I would say Nagmalata is one of the cards that might have responded to the meta because they know how important some of the monsters are to ice.
And even them saying like, oh yeah, Flans are seeing more play in ice, and Scale Toad's a card.
Mm-hmm.
And we should probably add to the overall monster support in ice.
Yeah.
I'm just having trouble seeing where this is coming from in any specific context, because like there's a lot of cards. Was Citra Opus 10? Was Citra Opus 10 or Opus 9? I want to say she was Opus 10.
Let me double check the filters here on FF decks, and we'll see. Yeah, Citra was Opus 10.
Okay, so like I'm just confused as to why he's saying like Opus 10 of all things. Like,
yeah, that's specific. If you had said, if they hadn't said the set, then I'd be more inclined to see where they're coming from. But I personally struggle, just like you, to see what cards in this set give that opinion. Not to say that opinion's invalid by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just having a hard time reading it.
There's another card that came into mind is Falthanos. Because Falthanos, I want to say he's like almost this like mandatory one of in Lightning decks, right?
Yeah.
But you have to understand that there's cards that came before Opus 10 that when that card came up, we said this is a mandatory run.
Mm-hmm.
And one that definitely comes to mind is Astinian. Like, Astinian was this insane card when it came out. We still kind of considered it an insane card, but it's been seeing less and less play, despite the fact that we considered it like a meta-defining card.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other quote-unquote meta-defining cards that have come out that, despite the fact that they were very good, and despite the fact that they may even still see play, they haven't centralized, or they centralized the meta for a short period, and then they kind of washed away. Another good example of this, we've talked about him 100 times on the show, is Veritas. And Veritas is a card where people were specifically running counters to Veritas in their deck, and he really did centralize the meta around himself, and then he started fading out. And he still sees play, and he still, you know, is around, but that was an Opus 8 card that really was this insane card where people were specifically slotting in cards into their deck just to counter him or just to get a benefit off of his secondary effect.
Mm-hmm.
I'm confused as to why he's like focusing on like Opus 10 and beyond.
Yeah, like,
And this is something that we've seen in the game a lot, and that's always what's going to happen in card games. They're going to release a card that's very, very good, and people are going to try to build around it and focus on it and kind of see where it goes.
yeah, like I'm looking at the list of cards in the whole set, and
Yeah.
I'm seeing maybe 4 or 5 cards that might validate this opinion. Obviously, we're not also looking at Opus 11, but we haven't had that for very long still. So, I see about maybe 4 or 5 cards across 3 colors that
And
might truly and fully validate this opinion. The rest of those cards are just pretty good cards that found their way into the meta or made a big splash.
I'm also going to plug your philosophy really quick, where we have these sets that it goes like power creep set, interesting set, cool off set, power creep set, and it keeps going on like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what I do definitely see in Opus 10. And looking at Opus 11, like Opus 11 has some really good cards, but nothing absolutely insane.
Yeah, nothing groundbreaking that really disrupts anything.
Like there's a lot of cards that they are, a little bit of a shake, like Braska or Braska's Final Aeon, Kuchess Pell in, Fire.
Yeah, but the
even
rule change of that was relevant to Kuchess Spell is what was shaking things up more than the card itself.
Because even going through my favorite color in Ice, like Ice didn't really get much in Opus 11 outside of Mute. And you could argue Sephiroth, and you could even argue that Sephiroth's one of those cards that is kind of warping the meta around it. God, I feel like I'm so scatterbrained about this question, but I think ultimately what I'm saying is that this has been happening a lot longer, and I don't think it's making the meta stale. Because despite the fact that we have had these cards that are meta shifting before, and while it did define a meta, we are still seeing other decks constantly come in. Like, Weewa is still an extremely powerful deck, despite the fact that we're in Opus 11 now, and Weewa uses very few cards from, Opus 10, really.
Yeah, I mean,
like, it started shifting in Citra. That's about it. Like,
yeah, I'm. The more I read this question, the more I see the philosophy of I prefer the Lawless Wasteland that was Opus 1 through, I don't know, 7, maybe.
yeah,
And when they started making things more centralized, it took a nebula and it funneled it into, it took gravity and it spun it into, a dwarf star. And now it's, gravity actually has its hold and it's becoming something more contained in terms of design. And yeah, I can understand how some people might not like that, but ultimately that's kind of the path that a game has to go once it finds its niche, finds how it wants to design itself. Prior to this, I think that the designers of the game were just kind of trying to be sure that they made a good game. And now that they've established, yes, this game is good, then they're like, well, now where do we go with it? How do we keep it good?
and this is also just a symptom of power creep, and power creep's going to happen in every game, especially a game where there's no ban list.
Yeah, especially when they're
But-
currently not making up new mechanics either.
Well, they've been sneaking. Well, rather they're not making. I'm trying to think of how to describe this. They're not making new game pieces in a way. Like,
Yeah.
we're probably not gonna be seeing another card type next set, but we are gonna be seeing the damage keyword. We've seen the counter keyword, and even next we're getting multicolored cards.
Mhm.
That's gonna tie into another question, and I want to talk about that a little bit more when we get to that. But yeah, Jacob, if you're watching this, feel free to comment or send us a message. It's I
Yeah,
kind of see where you're coming from, but I feel like this is something that's been in the game since basically we started playing. It's not. I don't think it's exclusive to Opus.
yeah. I think this is the one question that we should have really asked for clarification on, so we could talk about it better. But yeah, Jacob, if you're watching, some clarification would be awesome on what you meant. We can always revisit this and chat about it. Love to hear back.
Then I think overall the meta's been relatively healthy for the last while. Even
Yeah,
when we do enter these like 3-4 deck formats, like comparing that to Yu-Gi-Oh, like we did in our Yu-Gi-Oh video.
which comes
Um,
out the day of recording this.
ooh, yeah, and overall it wasn't comparing Final Fantasy to once again Yu-Gi-Oh, where Yu-Gi-Oh has like a 2 deck format or a 1 deck format or a 3 deck format. The fact that we do have this almost essentially 4 deck format, but we do have a lot of rogue decks that just kind of pop up and they do well for a tournament. Like I feel like it's a little gloom and doomy to say that like uh, the competitive environment even like right now is unhealthy and unfun.
Yeah. So I think we can press onward. We good? We good?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. So Eureka Minus from Reddit says this lukewarm take. Thaumaturge and Dottaluma could come off the ban list. Both would be strong, and both would shake up the meta, particularly Dottaluma. But the real reason they stay on there is because people are afraid of them and complained about them a lot.
I have to give a shout out to Eureka Minus. He's in like every subreddit thread. He's like constantly helping people out. He's really cool. I really like him. Anyway, um, but I agree with him with like an asterisk. You know how I feel about banning cards.
Yeah.
Um, but I 100% agree that Thaumaturge could come off the ban list, and I don't even think it would shake up the. It would basically be an auto included ice again. And we could even push for another turbo ice variant. But even Daddy, in a way, I actually kind of agree could come off the ban list, and he would give the meta quite a shakeup.
But there's so many ways around it now. There's so many answers to both of those cards.
Yeah, but at the same time, Dad has also gotten better. There's other ways to target him. He'd exist in a meta with Lucretius.
Yeah, yeah. And like the designers even said, like part of the reason we're banning, Dottaluma is, we're it's preemptive. We know what we're doing that's gonna break this.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's lukewarm for that.
How far the game has come, I'm not sure if Dataluma would be broken coming back.
Yeah.
This is where I agree with Eureka Minus, where he said it would shake up the meta, and we would be seeing Dataluma decks again.
Yeah, no, for sure.
At the same time, how much can Dataluma compete against Rampier? How much can Dataluma compete against, other particularly strong deck? And I do agree that I feel like the only reason why they are really on there is because why they've been staying on there is because people did complain about them.
Yeah, I mean, when a card is so dominant, and not everybody knows about all of its potential counters and responses and answers, I can see how complaints would heavily influence things. I mean, it's a bad example, but look at the Smite Reddit. The developers, high res takes so much from that Reddit instead of from the actual professional players that, items get changed on a whim, obviously with some thought. Characters get nerfed and buffed depending on, seemingly depending on that Reddit whim.
On the community's whim.
Yeah, and so like it's the community that they shouldn't. I don't want to say they shouldn't be talking to the community, but the weight there should be distributed evenly so that the professional players or the best players in the world should be able to put their opinion in first and then consider the opinion of the community. And similar things could be said here, even though it was pretty obvious what the professional player's opinion was because Dottaluma was in 55% of decks when
Dottaluma was a very strong card at the time.
Yeah.
I think ultimately the question of whether or not I do feel like part of the reason Thaumaturge and Dottaluma have stayed on the balance is because of player perception.
Yeah,
Um,
those are cards that I think are very strong argument points for the suspension list.
but ultimately, how I feel about Dodaluma is I'd like to see him reintroduced just to see how he'd handle today's meta because he's been in Opus 8. No, obviously, Opus 8 was a very strong set, or he wasn't released in Opus 8. He was banned in Opus 8. I think was it Opus 8? Yeah, it was
It
on
was
Opus
seven or
8's
eight.
release, right?
Yeah, it was 7 or 8.
Um, and what was I gonna say?
You know,
Obviously, he was a good card, but the question is, could he survive in an Opus 11, Opus 12 meta? And I feel like he would survive. He just wouldn't be as dominant as he previously was.
you know what? Maybe we should just do a ban listless recording of just us playing a couple games without a ban list.
We could even get our community in on it and just
Oh
see if we could
yeah,
have like a bandless list tournament. So we could have like Turbo Ice come back and see how we or Earthwind would do and how Milriku would do.
hey Ty, you know how we were saying the other day that we have the itch to cast again?
Yeah, ooh, yeah, we'll talk to them about it.
Yep.
We'll see.
So yeah, that one's. I think this one's a very strong argument. You can make in either direction. It's very much a seesaw of you can lean heavy one way, lean heavy the other way, or you can balance in between. Really depends on your experiences, your community, your personal thoughts. There's a lot of influence here.
But I definitely agree with Eureka Minus on this one. I think they are two cards that could very legitimately come off the ban list. Daddy would be a bit more of a event,
Yeah,
I suppose.
yeah,
I could 100% see Thaumaturge just one for one coming off the ban list.
yup. But you know how English. You know who I agree with is Wogman from Reddit. With their lukewarm opinion, saying Valifor was never that oppressive. People just don't want to play around it. Thank you.
I'm on your boat. I 100% agree with this take. I do think it is. I'd even say that it is a hot take. I'd even argue that it is that so many people when Riku got banned was like Valifor is the one that should have gotten banned. And while I agree with that, I never thought Riku was just outright the problem.
Yeah,
Um,
it's the context in which Riku was being used. Like
yeah,
honestly, the only time I've ever actually had a problem with Valifor is when I swung in and hit two of them on EX on you,
yeah.
and I did that to myself.
Yeah. And on top of that, yeah, you ate 6k on your board and that wiped your board. But I couldn't use those Valifors for the rest of the game.
Exactly. That actually
There was
technically
even
was
like
good.
yeah. The big thing about this one is that Valifor doesn't exist in a vacuum, and a Valifor can't just be played in a vacuum. You can't just throw Valifor into like a mono fire deck.
Yeah.
Like you can't even throw Valifor into like a traditional like mono wind deck because well maybe now with the new Yuna, but Valifor can't exist by itself. It has to have that assistance of Yuna to make it really good.
Yeah, which is why I
And
think it was a
that's
genius call to not make it light.
yeah.
Because it could have
That's
been light, and that would have been
yeah.
scary.
That's why I really don't think it was that impressive. I think Weewa is an incredibly good deck, and I've even joked on the show, and I did write down the notes of why I think that Weewa not should be banned, but why I was going to argue that it's too good. And even in a couple ways, I still think that.
Yeah.
But Valifor is, an arsenal of Weewa, and it's its strongest weapon.
Yeah.
Valifor can't really exist outside of Weewa.
Yeah, I mean, it can. It's just not nearly as useful.
Exactly.
You need that Porum to get it back. You need recursion for it. You need ways to cast it or, easier or buff it. And again, if it hits damage, that's one less Valifor to hit.
Like there's a reason we haven't seen like a Valifor Rampure list or something. Like there's a reason why we haven't seen Valifor in all these other decks, and it's because Valifor only really can exist in one type of deck.
However, I can't wait to see the people watching kind of prove us wrong with, the one person who comes up with the one crazy deck that's like, you know what? Screw you, I'm putting Valifor in Earth. Or I'm putting Valifor in this other thing.
We're doing Valifor Rampure. We're doing Valifor fire Ritz, like
No,
something
fair
goofy.
warning. If we do a ban list tournament, I'm gonna put Valifor with Dodaluma and
Yeah,
Cactuar. Like I'm doing it.
yeah.
Um,
Definitely give. I'd definitely be replaying a Turbo Ice.
but that being said, I think there are a lot of ways to deal with Valifor. I mean, it is 3K, so unless you're, yeah, re-upping your backup so you have Yuna is awesome. But not everybody's casting it with Yuna on board. Um, and it's 3K, right? Like a lot of things these days are bigger than that.
Yeah.
Earth has quite a few cards that can't be broken. Period. Um, you
And
have ways
I
of
hate to say this after I like really kind of tore it apart, but you could run Minwu. Like it's
yeah, like Minwu's an
yeah,
option.
it's
I mean, unless you have Kucha spell in your deck that doesn't let you reduce damage taken, like
which
cool.
Weewa wouldn't be running. Like it's that's the thing is like
Someone's gonna
Valifor
do
can't
it.
really. Valifor just has so much trouble living outside of Weewa.
It's
I
a
don't think it's an issue.
yeah, it'd be a fish out of water in most other decks.
But yeah, ultimately, I agree with Wogman. I do think Valifor is a very powerful card. I think it's one of the best weapons in Weewa's arsenal, but I don't want to say it's impressive.
Yeah, I mean it's another one of the. It's the same situation as Veritas was in, where Veritas was a really good card. There were answers to it all along. People just didn't look for them or utilize them.
Or they did start utilizing them, and
Well,
people
obviously,
just
yeah, because Veritas
people
isn't.
didn't want to follow up with that, or
Yeah,
people stopped running Veritas, etc.
I was gonna say Veritas kind of fell out of favor because other better cards came out, but also because you know the responses became prevalent. So, um, I guess we can move on.
So this is the one that got me a little heated, honestly.
All right. Do you wanna
Still
go
feel
again?
yeah.
All right, go for it.
A relic from Reddit says dev team was not creative enough and did not know how to open a new space, but took too few risks. The core mechanics are strong, but the design team has 10 sets now. No,
You
now
wrote the
to
wrong
build.
word. Yeah.
I copy pasted it.
Oh
My
well.
defense. Has 10 sets now to build in significant upgrades to the game, and have only managed a few minor ones. The game is bleeding players and won't last much longer. So I really want to know if Relic played Yu-Gi-Oh, but that's so. Have you heard of a series called The Seven Deadly Sins of Trading Card Games, Eric?
It's funny. I actually just found that the other day while I was sitting bored at work.
Yeah, yeah. So I've been listening to a couple of his episodes. I'm a big fan. Check it out if you haven't already. Very great, like game design insight into trading card games. And something that he mentioned is like front loading your game a lot and just putting in all these crazy features like right off the bat, and not having that kind of feature creep in a way. So my issue with this is number one is that they're working on putting in these new mechanics through the form of keywords like damage. We're getting the multicolored cards next set, but I feel like if they front loaded the game with all of that, nobody would really play it. A game shouldn't have to be super duper flashy and have all these crazy mechanics right out of the gate. You have to build to it because
Yeah.
otherwise you won't get that base set. You won't get those cards that lead up to it, and then it just ends up becoming kind of like this power creep race.
Well, it's also too much for new players. It's too intimidating. I would say that it also it just has it yeah it becomes impossible to balance. It becomes impossible to develop and design around because you have to just figure out what to focus on later on. There's just a lot of issues that that's just three off the top of my head that creates having too much. As you said, the front loading is a very good word for that.
And like as he said, we're 10 cents in now, but like they have been slowly building the game. The fact that they haven't put in like 3 or 4 new systems in those 10 sets is more than fine. Like if you look at Magic the Gathering got equipment, I think like 20 sets in.
Yeah,
and it started with like lands, creatures, instance enchantments or interrupts at the time, enchantments, etc. It had this very strong base, and that's what Final Fantasy has and has had. And then even then in Opus 4 we got the mix up that was monsters.
I mean, yeah. What the first thing I think of, I think back to classic, like really old Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh. Pokemon coasted on its same base mechanics for a really long time. What was it? Like 1997 or 98, all the way
Yeah.
till what was it, like 2004 when they came out with EX cards?
It started with I think Level X it was
Oh
called.
yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
Uh,
what I was thinking of, is the original
Even that was like
EXs.
I think 2005,
Yeah, and then they
2004
developed
maybe.
like other mechanics and stuff to go along with it, and now we go about 2-3 years before a new mechanic is released every time.
Exactly.
Final Fantasy, and Yu-Gi-Oh, we started off with monsters, spells, traps, and fusion monsters, which relied on the spells,
And
and the
ritual monsters
ritual monsters,
also.
which were basically fusionless fusion monsters. I mean, am I
It
wrong?
also had to be main deck. It was weird,
Yeah,
but like
but like, and then
the
Yu-Gi-Oh didn't get a new mechanic until what, Synchros,
yeah,
more or less.
yeah.
So, and that was like 7 years, six.
But
Um,
also consider like the big thing that people love about Yu-Gi-Oh to the point where they made their own fan-made format is GOAT format. Like
mhm.
that was before synchros were extremely strong and synchros like really took over the game. That was before Xyz, that was before Pendulum, and that was before Link Monsters. Like, and that was considered the best part or the best era of the game. Is right before the game got super duper complex.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, I agree with him when he says like the core strong and the game needs to live on those core mechanics for more than 10 sets.
Yeah,
And
I
I
think
feel
we have
like the
another. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, and how they've started kind of emulating Magic in which they introduce like a kind of new mechanic or they'll introduce a keyword, I think is kind of the way to go here because you're able to have these things that you can revisit and these mechanics that you can redo and implement in further sets without completely changing the game. Like
Yeah,
any player who, let's say someone quit in Opus 7 and they come back in Opus 15, seeing counters, damage, and multicolor cards, it's a natural progression. It's not an entirely new thing. They don't need to learn how equipment works. They don't need to learn how like location. Let's say they introduce location cards in Final Fantasy or something. They don't need to completely learn how to do location cards. But if you take a Yu-Gi-Oh player that played, let's say in GOAT format, and they try to play the game now, it's a completely different game, and you lose returning players, and it's also harder for newer players to get into it because there's all these features and all these crazy
well,
things.
that's something I was gonna say. Is that natural progression makes sense, but look, I mean, look at how it was when I came back to Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah,
I hadn't played since 2004 ish, and so coming back, I'm like, the hell is a synchro card? What's an Xyz? What's pendulum? What's the? We had to sit down. You and I sat there, and you explained this stuff to me. Like, it took what, 3.5 days of just binging Yu-Gi-Oh to
yeah,
learn these new mechanics and make sure I understood them in every facet. And then, it was overwhelming. I actually almost didn't want to do it. I mean, you
yeah.
pushed me, and here we are. But you know,
Because Yu-Gi-Oh had this issue with feature creep, where there were just too many features in the game, and there was constant new summoning mechanics, and new this, constantly, over and over, and that's what I think ultimately drags down Yu-Gi-Oh as a game. So I don't, I don't see any issue with how slow Final Fantasy's taking it, and the game isn't exactly stale. I
yeah,
mean,
it's
we've
only a
had
couple
tons
years
of other
old.
hot takes about how this is too good and this is too crazy and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think they've been a good amount of creative. I think we have seen very interesting cards every set, and we have seen the meta shift in very interesting ways that hasn't completely thrown everything off the table.
Yeah, I mean, could they introduce more mechanics and stuff? Sure. Could they introduce a new card type? That'd be cool. But I think they need to really carefully consider how they do it over time. I'm sure, considering how involved and present the development and design team is with the community, I think they hear us. I just don't think they know how to answer us yet.
Or they just want to take it slow
Yeah,
and
I mean
understandable.
I think they're being smart about it. However, whatever they're doing. Again, it's only been 3 years, right? We've only had about 3.5 years with this game being out. Since it's being basically a reboot of chapters. And don't forget, they're trying to make sure they don't repeat the mistakes of chapters. That is a huge deal.
Yeah,
Um,
that's actually a good point. You could really point at chapters as a way of doing kind of feature creep because for a while, I think it was like Opus 5 through 15, really, there was like a new mechanic every set and they had something crazy every set. And it just eventually got to the point where the game kind of folded in on itself because it
yeah.
wasn't balanced. They
Well,
didn't
we
focus
talked
too much on the balance of it.
we talked about that in our chapters episode where we're just like, this will never come back because this is ridiculous. Why'd they even think of this? And it was just the answer was probably, oh well, they wanted to advance the game in some way, and that's too much. So if it's between too much and too little at a time, as long as they keep making new sets, too little is fine by me.
I'm
So
fine with just very solid gameplay, even if it's not insane. I don't want to have like these 3-turn games. I want to just kind of have these nice kind of, chill games where I can have my deck, I can improve it, I could like look into doing other decks, etc.
yeah, um,
And then I just ultimately disagree. I on the game is bleeding players and won't last too much longer. To go back to the Seven Deadly Sins, he constantly brings up the 2-year curse and how like a card game rarely lasts after 2 years, and we're in our third year. And we can only really speak for our community. We don't have like the exact numbers of how many people are playing around the world, but our community has been it's been sticking strong. We've seen a couple new players. We have a couple of people interested.
I mean, my
So
metric that I sorry, go.
No, you go ahead.
Okay,
I don't have
fine.
anything else to say.
Okay. I was gonna say the metric I go by are interaction. We have so I work at a shop. I'm biased. I see it firsthand that this game is growing. That doesn't count, especially because it's local. What I go by is online internet interactions. We have more people joining the Facebook groups. We have more people joining the Reddit communities. We have more content creators popping up. We have FF decks where more tournaments and more deck profiles are being submitted regularly.
Even in a pandemic.
Yeah, we have, all these people who are itching to get back to the game, and we have people asking more often than ever, hey, is there a community around X area? Which shows me that people have interest in playing the game. I've only ever seen 4 people directly jump out and say they're not coming back to this game. And again, that's my anecdotal experience. I can't speak for globally or even nationally. But I think there are more people coming into the game than there were before, and the game is holding stable.
Yeah, I just disagree with the statement like the game is bleeding players. Because it's like, once again, we've both seen people leave this game for like reasons. They want to go back to Magic, or it was just a financial strain.
Or there's that one guy who just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Yeah, the guy who just disappeared. That was weird.
Yeah, I still don't understand. I hope he's okay.
Yeah.
Whatever happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't see evidence that the game is bleeding players. Like losing, sure. Like every game loses players, and as long as we're not losing players more than we're actually gaining them, we're fine. There's a kind of an equilibrium to be had. But I'm curious to see why the bleeding players, such drastic terminology is used.
Yeah.
Maybe there is evidence. Maybe there's evidence we haven't seen. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like
overall, it seems to be growing, at least on our end.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask a distributor, I mean, we've had discussions at the shop, with the distributors, saying, oh, well, we have less people buying, this and that and whatever product. Like the game's having a hard time right now from a sales standpoint, and that's weird. That's a really hard thing to discuss because that's a whole other can of worms that, you're going into a very different topic than just the game's health. I mean, at its height, Dragon Ball Super had the same issue. at its height, when it had the most players, that was the issue. So like, there's some weird things to talk about there, but that's a different discussion for a different video. Um, Ty, do we want to move on, or do you have anything else to say?
That's about it. I don't know. I'm just being super optimistic about it, and obviously we were both very biased, seeing as we have a podcast about the game. But I don't know. I think this take is just kind of pessimistic about it.
I mean,
You know,
that's okay.
because I'm just wondering like what he's comparing this game to say that like the game's not well designed or the game's not progressing fast enough. Like,
Yeah, perspective is always irrelevant.
I feel like
Point.
the only thing that I can mention is like it really feels like the team does take its time to make sure that they don't constantly break the game. Um, Especially when you compare this to like Magic the Gathering that introduced companions, and
Yeah,
they had quite the time with that to the point where they had to completely change how the mechanic works. Uh, and that happened like last month, which is insane to me.
wow.
At least we haven't hit that yet. We haven't had any time where they introduced a mechanic and had to immediately say, no, that's not how it works. We have to change it because it's too good.
Yeah, yeah.
Our Final Fantasy versus MTG episode is coming up soon, I promise. But should we move on to the other one? This is, in my opinion, one of the like hottest takes here.
I'd agree. Yeah, this is a hot take.
Yeah, and do you want to go for it?
All right, yeah. So a name that you guys might recognize, a more than once world's level player, Christopher Matisky, uh, commented on our post on the Final Fantasy North America page. Says every game revolves around Kadaj now, and I assume that means that if Kadaj hits the field, the whole game revolves around that card. That or hey, maybe it's an auto include in every deck, and the whole game as a card game is revolving around Kadaj.
I I overall disagree. I kind of see where he's coming from. I view Kadaj kind of as like the new Veritas. And that's always going to happen. We're always going to have the new Veritas. We're going to have the new Kadaj eventually, I'm sure. But I don't think Kadaj is like an auto include in every deck. How do you feel about this?
Um, I think I'd pretty much generally fully agree. It's a really good card. Like I groan when I see it. It's a solid card. It's definitely, at worst a one of include in many decks. But I think just like everything else in this game, there's enough answers to it already, carefully considered by the design team, that can deal with it. You just have to have have the tools available. You have to be you when you're playing when you're a craftsman, you consider carefully what tools to put on your belt when you go out to the field, and a seasoned player will know that this card is relevant and a very real possibility of seeing it in a match. So they'll probably tech in one or two options, and those aren't just specific to Kadaj. It's not there aren't any cards that say if Kadaj is waiting to be put back onto the field from removed from game, do this. Like that's not a thing. There's answers, there's responses, there's ways to deal with it. Sure, you have to draw them, you have to have them in your hand or on the field, depending. But yeah, I wouldn't say every game revolves around Kadaj. Certainly, it's a threat. Absolutely a threat. Absolutely a strong card that you have to nip in the bud before it becomes too recurring and prevalent in the match. But that's all it is. That's just me. I'm not a world's level player, so
Yeah, once again, that's always going to be it. Is like obviously we're not world's level players, but I view Kadaj kind of in the same lens that I viewed Veritas in, where he's a card that can basically be slotted into every deck with very little to no issue. He's a very powerful card, and he will stay a very powerful card for this meta and probably the next. But to say that the entire game revolves around him, I think is wrong because like Veritas, people were putting in cards specifically to answer Veritas, and I'm struggling to think of how much people have shifted to specifically play against Kadaj. Um, but at the same time, we haven't exactly been in a whole lot of tournaments lately, so I
True.
can't really speak for how much people have really.
Yeah, I
Trying
mean,
to think of what I was going to say. We haven't seen how people have been answering Kadaj and how many people have been answering Kadaj. Um, but I think just ultimately how I'm saying is just, it's. I think Kadaj is good. I don't think it's good enough to rotate or to have the whole game revolve around him.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, hey, so this again, this is a hot take because it definitely got us discussing. That's the point of a hot take is get people discussing. Have the controversy around it. Um, but yeah, I think we can both agree that we disagree with this hot take.
Though I do see where he's coming from. Kadaj is bonkers. And Kadaj is a card that could do something that like no other card in the game can do right now.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said, like it's a card that you can include with very little consequence, and you want to nip it in the bud before it becomes too big a problem to deal with. The longer it stays around, the more important it is. I don't know who that phone number is. Stop calling me. Um, but yeah, I don't again, without more tournaments and without more events and large scale, like high IQ plays being shown, I don't see any direct evidence that this card is too much of a problem, too present in the game, etc. Um, but again, I'm saying this is a world's level player making this comment, and I don't know how many other world's level players agree, but grain of salt with our opinion because experience and skill.
Like obviously Matiski's know when to like your nose up or to like brush off. I see where he's coming from. I'll say that at least. Like I definitely see where he's coming from. I just feel like it's hyperbole.
Yeah, I mean for the time being, until we have more evidence to play with, until we have more, until we have more seasoning, in general with this card, let it mature. Hard to say whether this is objectively right or wrong. I mean, history. Once we write the history on this card, we might find it was only relevant for one set. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, like look at Hian. Like Hian was this card that was. I don't want to say he's the same as Kadaj, but it was a card that everybody was like, "Oh, this is extremely good," and obviously Hian's still a very good card. But the fact that Hian was just such a one meta card, it seems like right now.
Yeah, so far, like we'll see, but
We'll see. That's the thing is like Kadaj is just also such a new card that it was like, oh, we specifically had one tournament with it, and then we haven't been able to play with it since.
yeah, I've in that tournament I encountered one copy of this card.
But I played it a lot. I played Kadaj a lot at Bahamut Brawl. I
I'm
love that
sure.
card, honestly.
But you mean Summoner's Cup?
Oh yeah, Summer's Cup, yeah.
I was like, I don't remember us playing in Bahamut Brawl. Did I? Was I casting with a clone of yours?
Obviously, that's what I was doing when I was off judging.
Damn. Well, you didn't place
So
top four, so whatever.
yeah. Okay, you ready for the final hot take that I included specifically because I'm very salty about it?
Let's do
I'm not
it.
salty about it. I just vehemently disagree.
You feel attacked, Ty. Just be
Well,
straight with us.
Okay, I'm gonna be nice. Well, whatever. Okay, so GGTNCB from Reddit said 7-drop Sephiroth is overrated and always seems to be judged based on its ceiling when its floor is awful. You can't judge any card based on the best possible outcome. Why is Sephiroth the exception? Also, it needs to not be $35 so I could justify buying one. So the reason I wanted to talk about this one so much is because I agreed with it a while ago.
That was your original
definitely-
reaction.
Yeah, that was my reaction to 7-drop Sephiroth. Is I was like, at its best, it's good. At its worst, it's unplayable. 7-drop 8K do nothing. If they have no cards in hand. But the reason why Sephiroth is so good is because number one, he's one of the cards that can make the opponent discard once a turn. The only other card that has been able to do that is Scale Toad, and Scale Toad and Gesper. But neither of those cards makes the opponent discard 2. So the fact that Sephiroth can get that discard 2 every turn is what really makes him good. So obviously that includes playing multiple Sephiroths, and obviously this is once again kind of I don't want to say a dream situation, but it's not his floor. But I feel like how this person's looking at it is like, even in the middle, even in not the best situation where you can play Sephiroth is still really good. Unless the opponent has no cards in their hand and has no forwards on the field, you can basically play him. Because being able to A, threaten to make the opponent discard 2 with his special, and B, being able to dull and free something if they decide to play out their hand on their turn is nuts. And it's not as nuts on paper. It's not as ridiculous when you're just looking at it. But when you really start playing with it, and when you really get that 3 of, and you start running more Sephiroths, oh my god, dude. It is so good.
Yeah, like, it's definitely a card that, yeah, its presence is threatening, and it's a card that, yeah, it doesn't look intimidating, and then you face it down, and you're just like, oh, crap. Like, you have to build part of the deck around it, absolutely. So, if the deck isn't, factored for Sephiroth, it's going to be a hard time getting him off and making him useful. But, I think the final piece, the final sentence of this, of this take kind of contradicts the first part of it needs to be not be 35 so I can justify buying one. I mean, the fact that you want one kind of tells us that it's you don't fully believe what you're saying.
That's mean. He's Sephiroth.
No,
he's a fan favorite.
I know. I'm jabbing, but like,
he's not only Sephiroth, but he's Kingdom Hearts Sephiroth. Like,
that my snap reaction. That was my snap reaction when I first read this. I was like, well, you want one, so
yeah.
But no, that's.
Obviously, I disagree with him on the first part, only because I've played with it. This is like the one hot take that I can 100% say, like, trust me on this one, bro. Because I've been playing Earth Ice for like ever. I've played Sephiroth at 1, 2, and 3, and I stick with him at 3 now, obviously. But the one thing I do really agree with, you should not be $35. He's a very good card. He's Sephiroth. He's a very fan favorite card. But $35 for a card that belongs in like exclusively ice decks? Like,
yeah, like the Universal Include Veritas was like 35-40 at its peak. And is now like 18, 16, something like that. When I looked it up the other day, it's still not low, but it's not high either. That being said, yeah, it's a really good card, and many people will agree that it's a good card, which is what makes this a hot take. There's a lot of disagreement to be had there, but yeah, it should be cheaper because it only fits in like 1 to 2 types of decks. So.
Yeah. Playing it in Mono Ice, you're playing it in Earth Ice, or you're playing it in Vice Kings if you still play Vice Kings. Mm-hmm. I know there's some people that have been playing it in Rampir.
Yeah, like 3-4 color Rampir. Yeah.
So I could kind of see it, but overall, no.
Yeah. I mean, it might just be the scarcity of the card that makes it expensive, rather than the actual card itself. But that's that's another discussion. And they're available. I know they're available. They're out there. Opus 7 is still being sold, so go get them, guys.
But ultimately, like, thing is, anything above the absolute floor of Sephiroth is very good.
Yeah, and hitting that floor is so rare.
Yeah, because like paying 7 for let's say they have 1 card in hand. Paying 7 for an 8K Sephiroth to make them discard 1 isn't great, but you also have to consider that you still have access to the special and you still have access to the dull and freeze, and that's what pushes him over.
Yeah, so assuming you're building your deck well and around Sephiroth, you're not putting yourself in much of a dangerous position by running it. Worst case, you can discard it. Like, it doesn't have to be played just because you have it in your hand. and you can get them back, and it's a card that I promise is better than it looks on paper. So
Hop on Octagon and mess around with it. Like it's don't go out of your way to play it, if you don't have to. But once you get the feel for Sephiroth, like oh my god, dude, it's so good.
yeah,
Just thinking about all the games where I've locked you out of playing, where I've locked him out of playing. There was the game that I at Summer's Cup, Chuck, the Mono Fire player, when I locked
hmm
him out of playing. Oh my god, it was awesome.
yeah. You know what? Maybe this guy's maybe GG's right. Screw Sephiroth. You're an ass.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Right.
but yeah. So, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, there were some other hot takes that I saw. Don't want to touch down on them because I already know this is a long episode. Um, but thanks everybody for your input. Thanks for commenting. We're probably going to do this again at some point. Maybe a couple sets down the line so we can get new hot takes just so people aren't complaining about like Minwoo.
I'd say maybe once a
Uh,
year, right after meta analysis.
yeah, I think that's kind of a good spot. We'll see. We'll see. We'll definitely have to see where the game goes.
Yeah. Oh, and
But
thank
I
you for
think once a
everybody.
year is
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
I think once a year is a good time to revisit this.
Cool. I was gonna say thank you everybody for being civil, and not arguing like children and wild monkeys in the chat. Everybody threw their opinions into the ring and just kind of said, "Okay, here's my thought." There was some discussion, but I didn't see anything uncivil going on. So, thanks for not, thanks for being monkeys in hats and not monkeys flinging poop.
Yeah. Everybody was super cool about it, and we're glad that we could do this. This was fun. I like
Oh yeah, this was
the
great.
idea of this.
I had a fun time. So, all right. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for listening to our hour and 40 something minutes of
Cool.
discussion. But hey, at least it's not our meta analysis 3 hour video. So, yeah. Guess we'll catch you guys in the next episode.
Yeah, see ya.